Welcome back to the History Shorts podcast, your daily, short format, history themed variety show and weekly conversation series with leading voices in history today. Today's conversation is brought to you by thecollector.com, the ultimate online destination for anyone passionate about art, history, and culture. Beautifully curated, easy to read, and perfect for history nerds who want reliable, inspiring content without the fluff. Thecollector.com is just waiting to be discovered. Today we're stepping into a world that many of us think of as dark, superstitious, and far removed from our own, the Middle Ages. Yet surprisingly, it was during these very centuries that Europe developed one of the most sophisticated frameworks for understanding human mind, as well as improving oneself, that the Western world had ever seen. Long before modern psychology or the multi-billion-dollar self-help industry, medieval thinkers, monks, mystics, and scholars were grappling with the same eternal questions, the ones we face today. Why do we sabotage ourselves? How do we master our worst impulses? And how can we live better, more meaningful lives despite our flaws? My guest today is the perfect person to bridge that distant world with our own. Peter Jones is a historian who earned his PhD in medieval history from New York University and has taught the subject for years, among others, at a university in Siberia. His fascination with the Middle Ages began as a child, but it was during a particularly harsh Siberian winter when he found himself in a dark place, and that he turned to medieval wisdom for answers. That personal journey led him to write his compelling new book, Self-Help from the Middle Ages: What the 7 Deadly Sins Can Teach Us About Living. In it, Peter explores how the 7 deadly sins were never meant to shame us into submission, but to illuminate the workings of the human heart and help us find our way back to balance and purpose. A quick word from our sponsors. Well, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So my first question is, this kind of comes out of a dark place. This book comes out of a dark place in your life. And what is fascinating when I started reading it is you are in the middle of a Siberian winter, right? What are you doing in Siberia? And how does that lead to this particular book?
Well, so I'm an academic. My wife's an academic, and we were looking for jobs that would be 2 jobs in the same place, the 2-body problem. And my wife thought that Chimin was in Germany, actually, when she applied. So I kind of blame her. But like, once the offer, we did the Skype interview, we went over together. And once the offer was there, it was too exciting. I was at this school called the School of Advanced Studies in Chimin in Siberia. And it was teaching in the English language. And it was supposed to be a bridge to the West for the next generation of Russian students. So it was really great fun. But my wife took a job back in Dublin. It's really complicated. And I, as a fool, chose to stay in Siberia.
You got stuck.
I wasn't ready to quit. I wasn't ready to quit being a historian. And I just wanted to teach a few more classes, just write a few more papers. Come on. So I taught a class on the 7 deadly sins when I was on my own, when my wife had gone. And it was a pretty dark place. It's a lonely place anyway, sometimes, especially my Russian's not great, and certainly was never great enough to really make good friends. And, and then suddenly my wife's gone. I was very, very lonely. I maxed out on at least gluttony of the 7 deadly sins. And the origins of this book, many times in my life, I've found myself in kind of a bit of a tight spot. And I've been a medieval historian now since, I guess, my early 20s, and I'm now 40. So many, many years in those tight spots, reading medieval texts has kind of brought me out of a dark place and reminded me why I love studying, why I love this academic life, which takes you to stupid places, and I got so much out of these texts. I mean, theology texts of the 12th and 13th centuries, not pop culture reading normally. But I thought there's so much here that actually, I want to share with people. So the origins of this book really are being in a bit of a dark place, being in a tight spot, and remembering that there's some really great texts and really wonderful ideas that maybe could help other people in a tight spot as well.
Was there any one specific, perhaps like medieval insight that kind or practice that you first turned to while you were kind of like, okay, I'm stuck in Siberia? Like, what was the one that kind of sparked this idea of let's write a whole book about this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this famous among medievalists text called The Summer of Vices by a guy called William Peraldus. It was written in the 13th century, the 1200s. It's never been edited or translated, right? It's too vast. There's a scholar, Siegfried Wenzel, who actually spent his entire career working on the translation. He recently died and it's still untranslated. So look, it's a big project. That text's so beautiful. I mean, when I was teaching the deadly sins, I came to sloth, and I was actually looking at manuscripts at that point in Dublin, actually, and the manuscript passage on sloth is just so arresting, and it's this passage where it talks about what it feels like to feel like you don't really care about anything anymore, the sin of sloth. And it's like you're standing in a rushing river and it's rushing against your legs, but you just feel like you can't move. And it feels like everything that used to give you joy leaves you feeling empty and cold, where you can't talk in any conversation, and your voice is kind of just mechanical. And I just found this so beautiful. And there's this line in it of William Peraldus, and he says, you have to try to remember that fields that had thorns and thistles and go on to have fruit later are more loved than fields that always gave fruit but never had thorns or thistles at all. And it's that idea that I just found it so striking. It was like, it really was like a hand reaching out of a text and grabbing mine and saying, look, people have had dark times like this all across history. But I found there's something so life affirming about that message. Just hold on, carry on, and remember that actually sometimes these difficult times are what make us, better in the long run. So yeah,
And this is 1300s. Isn't that crazy,
yeah,
right?
yeah, the 1230s, absolutely. And I think the pitch of the book really is that people spent a lot of time, the best minds spent the best part of their long, long lives studying the human brain, the mind, temptation, desire, like monks, the kind of people like William Peraldus, he's a Franciscan, but the kind of people writing texts like that, that's their day job. That's all they do. They dedicate their time to kind of studying how does the mind function when we're tempted, and how do we deal with that temptation? So it's a really rich culture, I think, of this kind of writing.
Absolutely. And I always tell my students how beautiful these are works of art themselves, these books. Like this is a time when people sat down to write and not everybody knew how to write. Like when you especially had monks and churches and Jesuits eventually all that stuff, when they wrote and created these texts, like these were sometimes lifelong projects that these guys worked on.
Absolutely. And the great thing is they're often community texts, right? In the sense that, number one, they're made for a community to use. Like the text I mentioned, William Proudus, there's a rubric at the top so you know which sin you're reading about. And so it's user-friendly in that way. And people have scribbled in the margins, across like decades, if not centuries. People have annotated, added things in, inserted comments and doodles that help, sometimes little diagrams. I found in one of these texts, little spider diagram to tell you about the five types of drunkenness, that somebody's added in maybe a century later. So that's what I love about a good manuscript like that is, it breathes and it evolves and it's a community-oriented text.
I love that. So most people today view the Middle Ages as an era of superstition, repression, even, you might say. Why do you argue that it was actually a golden age of self-help? And what does that say about how perhaps we've misunderstood medieval approaches to the human mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, of course, there was superstition. Yes, there was repression too. Like, I'm not going to liberate the Middle Ages totally from all of
Yeah.
that. But what I think there was an active outreach mission to try to deal with that stuff. Whether we like it or not, the church was expanding, and it was becoming it was reaching its way into every corner of life. That, in other words, priests would be trained, educated, and they would be community support. They would be therapists, really. After the year 1215, a thing called the Fourth Lateran Council, it became mandatory that every year, every person had to give confession. And the idea of that, it was, well, on the one hand, it's pretty radical because these confession sessions, if you got the right priest, could be like a therapy session. You're working through the 7 deadly sins one by one. How's your sloth this year? How's your ego doing? But on the other hand, it's like these You're going to have to edit this because I just lost the flow.
Yeah, no
Sorry.
worries.
Um, what was my point? Sorry, I
Confession.
clear
You're
it
talking
off.
about you have confession and like you go in and back then it was like therapy in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
On the other hand, there's this immense culture of texts that are coming out in this period. So after 1215, we have people writing treatises, and there are preachers who want to use these books. So preachers are more energized. Right, we're going to go into every community where we think there might be superstition or people practicing heresy or people just getting it wrong or lazy priests who let everyone away with everything. They need text, they need putting right. So there was this huge conscious approach that people need to be put on the right track, but on the right track of what? Really, of their kind of ethics and morality. So it's this extraordinary experiment in human history where so many people and so much resource was put into kind of curing people's moral and ethical failures. And yes, that could be pretty repressive in places. Talk to the burnt heretics, talk to a lot of other people who feel like, who felt that it was okay to worship greyhounds and maybe that, they shouldn't have these things stamped out. There's been a lot of great historical scholarship on the kind of superstitious and the alternative religion in the Middle Ages. But at its core, I think there's something kind of interesting and inspiring about that attempt to sort of get everyone on a moral page together.
absolutely. You framed these seven deadly sins not really as a do not do list, but kind of as a sophisticated philosophical map of how thinking goes astray. Which sin do you think surprised you the most in its modern parallels? I know perhaps envy on social media, sloth in the age of burnout, anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think, okay, so a couple. I mean, I think anger, just briefly, the great thing about the medieval diagnosis of anger is they say, look, it's not a problem to get angry. The problem is the addiction to anger. It's a thing which one writer called rixa, which is like quarrelsomeness. It's like, in other words, it's that moment where, look, I've just won an argument online and it felt good. And now I want another argument not because I want to put the world right necessarily, so much as it felt really good to win and be right. And I think they recognize this really well, that anger can be a kind of addiction, an addiction to being right. And that's the problem with anger, not necessarily always just losing control or being violent, although those are problems too. Pride, I suppose, is the most surprising, other than sloth. I mean, we've already kind of touched on sloth, which is a bit like depression, boredom, restlessness. Pride is interesting because this one, as a word in the modern world, feels like a really positive word. In the Middle Ages, it's really a way to talk about ego and self-obsession, self-absorption, the thing that we sometimes call narcissism, that kind of problem. Pride was the worst of the deadly sins. Usually, there was a ranking. Gregory the Great gave them a ranking in the 600s, and the ranking, pride's always at the top. And the reason is because it's the ultimate form of sin in terms of it's you turning your back on other people. If the sins are all understood as kind of antisocial behavioral patterns that can be okay in moderation, like a little bit of restlessness, a little bit of egotism insofar as I believe in myself, perfectly fine. The sins become sort of deadly, if you like, when they tip over that and go into kind of an antisocial pattern. And pride at its most antisocial is just ignoring everyone else. And it's when you ask your friend, do you think we should take a shortcut through the park or should we go the long way so we can go via the shop? And they say shortcut via the park. And you say, no, actually, let's go the long way. I need to get something at the shop. Like, why did I ask her advice? Pride is like, I don't need other people's advice. I can do everything on my own. That one's quite surprising, I think, because I don't think we necessarily think about a problem with ego being a problem with sort of over self-reliance. But I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, modern self help often emphasizes like positivity, right? Productivity, hacks, quick fixes, even in a sense. You could Google like, how do I'm depressed. What do I do? But how does the medieval tradition of confession, self examination, and forgiveness offer a much deeper and perhaps even more honest alternative, especially for issues like anxiety or addiction or grief?
Well, look, I mean, I think a lot of modern self-help is fantastic. And, I've benefited from it myself. I think CBT, things like that, they work. And medication works too, when it's necessary. But what I do like about the medieval system is it starts with a ground assumption that we all have all of these problems already, like they're built in. So, anxiety is really, I suppose, related to the restlessness and listlessness of sloth, which is that sin, which is to do with kind of withdrawing your heart from things or, worrying too much the sort of flip side. And, if you accept the seven deadly sins as they were in the Middle Ages, you begin with the assumption that these are the human patterns that we all have. Evagrius Ponticus, the kind of founding father of the seven deadly sins, he had 8 originally, but he called them the 8 generic thoughts. They weren't deadly sins, they were generic thoughts. And he thought these were the things that come to all of us, whether we like it or not, and no matter how good we are. So I think what I like about the seven deadly sins as they became, there's a forgivingness to it. That, look, we all suffer from this anger. It's inside all of us. We all have the potential to just become addicted to being right or whatever. We all have an egotistical tendency to kind of trust ourselves too much and just ignore other people's advice and things like that. So I like that. And I like the fact that at its heart, at its best, the medieval system was one that accepted that it's impossible to scrub these things out. You can't retreat, turn off your phone, go into the desert and just, scrub your mind of all your temptations. And I'm not saying that we all necessarily think that today, but I think sometimes there's an assumption with some of these pathways that, that we can overcome our ego, we can overcome our envy, we can live a pure life without that. And I think what I like is, no, it's a lifelong journey that never ends in medieval theology. I mean, Dante, who goes to paradise in Dante's Divine Comedy? Only the saints. The worst sinners all go to hell. They're the people who don't recognize that they've done anything wrong. But the rest of us, I hope it's us. I mean, maybe I belong in hell, but the rest of us go to purgatory because, and in purgatory for Dante, we all have to work through all 7 of the deadly sins one by one. We all have to carry a rock on our back for our pride. We all have to have our eyelids stitched together for our envy. And so what's built into that is an acceptance. No matter how good you are, no matter how brilliant or you are at sort of fighting your own temptations, you're still never complete. You still, that process of scrubbing out these things, because I think there's an acceptance that these are the temptations and the failings that make us human.
And kind of to close it up a little bit, it feels like this is so. It's for me, as even reading this book, it felt so awesome that this is all so relatable. But I'm really looking at medieval texts, and you were able to draw that out and put things in such plain language for the reader that normally you might be, you might feel nervous about approaching such a text or intimidated by a text. But you did a great job here, kind of putting this in today's words. So great job. I just want to commend you on that.
Thank you. That means a lot. That means a lot.
And I think that, go ahead.
Oh no, I just, as a historian, that's always been so important to me that we don't see the people of the past as exotic, as fundamentally different to us. That we can respect that they are different to us in so many ways. They have so different assumptions about so many things, but to give them the respect that they have minds just like ours, and that the burnout you or I feel in a crazy situation today is relatable, that we can contact. It's so important to not kind of, I see it as a kind of patronizing or condescending view of the past sometimes that we automatically have, that no, they wouldn't understand the world the way I do. So I feel like it's really important to make that connection.
So if you could, and then we're kind of closing out a little bit here, but if you could prescribe one medieval remedy from a specific sin for the average burned out, overworked, screen addicted, reader today, which would it be? And how might it work in practice? I guess that's our last big question.
I love the solution to pride, right? And this comes from different sources, but there's a poem by a guy called Jean de Condé, which is the poem of Two Mirrors, or the Book of Two Mirrors. And it's kind of the two ways we can look in a mirror. And one of them kind of leads to bigger ego problems and pride problems, and the other is kind of a much more healthy approach. And the paradox is, right, that pride is self-obsession, but actually sometimes it's not really self-obsession. It's actually obsession with an image of myself that I've invented that is a better sort of fantasy image of myself. And Jean de Condé in that poem says, like, you need to look in the mirror properly. The answer to your pride, to your ego, is not to say, oh, I won't think about myself. No, quite the opposite. Look harder and harder at ourselves and see ourselves for what we really are. The problem with pride is I build a fake image of myself, and I imagine myself to be so much better at all these things. And I imagine myself to be capable of all this stuff. The solution to it, it's not like humility. Oh, I'm a worm. I'm nothing. I can't do anything. That's also bad. That's what Thomas Aquinas called pusillanimity, weak spiritedness. The answer is to say just total honesty with self. Okay, open eyes in the mirror. What am I? I'm an aging man. I'm 40 now. I'm past my best.
Well, I don't know about that.
I'm okay. I'm okay as a historian. I should keep doing that. I'm probably never going to be a great electric guitarist. I mean, look, no, it's a kind of honesty with self, like knowing your limitations. And because what the sort of sin of superbia or pride teaches us in the Middle Ages is that the kind of, the top end of the spectrum of woeful sinners of pride are the kind of egomaniacs who think that they don't need to be accountable to anyone, that they can kind of get away with stuff because if they say it's okay, it kind of is okay because they've got this kind of image that they know what's going on. The solution is always to take a step back and say, actually, sometimes I just don't know. And it's really the solution to all of the deadly sins as a whole. All of the deadly sins, as they're understood in the Middle Ages, are a problem with not recognizing yourself and your situation for what it is. Anger. I'm addicted to being right. I'm not seeing where my anger could be useful or where it's actually starting to freak people out a bit. And it goes for all the sins. My envy. I'm fixated on how I don't want you to have the success you have because I'm sort of jealous. If I'm honest with myself, I can see that there's a reason you have that success and I don't, and I can accept it, So the solution to pride, I think, is the solution to all the deadly sins, which is kind of a radical and fundamental self-honesty.
I feel like you need to start a podcast on this. I mean that. Like you need to start a podcast on self-help from the Middle Ages. I mean, you're a Middle Ages historian, but maybe you could even translate that to, all right, now self-help from Buddhism, and start looking out at different. This could be a thing. I don't know, Pete. Yeah, I think you should consider that.
That's really kind. That's a great idea. I think in Zoroastrianism there are many more sins than 7, so I could have many more episodes than 7 if I turn to that.
Exactly. You could totally make this a thing. This is. I mean, I find this extremely helpful. So my last question for you is, I guess, 2 questions. First one is, did you have during this research? Because I mean, this took you across Europe, archives, libraries. Did you have one moment that kind of stuck with you and you were like, either like a big aha moment or like, wow, you're like, this is awesome, or this was really a meaningful day? Like one moment from this research process that kind of, stuck with you when there was like this big revelation or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many. I mean, one of them, I was in Lambeth Palace Library, the manuscript library in London, and I was looking through another text, another medieval text, unrelated, and I found in the binding there was a treatise on the 7 deadly sins, which had been used as part of the binding, right? So it's like, oh, we need to bind this book together quickly, grab something. Wow. We'll just and I think it's what's interesting about that is just, okay, that's how many of these there were. And that's how kind of commonplace they were. That's the moment when you realize, wow, copies of these 7 deadly sins treatises in the Middle Ages were kind of like copies of, I don't know, the Da Vinci Code. Is that a dated reference now? Yeah. I mean,
no, I guess it's still
50 Shades of Grey, 50 Shades of Grey. We could go forward in 10-year leaps. They were huge bestsellers, right? Then so much so that you can just, okay, that's fine. No one will miss that if we use that as a kind of binding.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But yeah, I mean, there were just millions, I suppose, or thousands of little moments along the way, or hundreds of little moments where you just kind of, it's all of those explosive moments where you see someone working through a problem. There was another manuscript moment in Oxford in a library there, and it's a dialogue between, this guy's made up a dialogue between himself, who he calls sinner, and his interlocutor, who's kind of his therapist figure, who he calls reason. And this dialogue, and he's so honest about how he says something like, in my life, I've never really done a good deed, because every time I did a good deed, I was doing it just to be good, not because I wanted good things to happen. And I thought, my goodness, I thought 2 things. Number one, that's me. Oh my God, I felt like that before, or I know people who feel like that too. It just feels so modern. But on the other hand, it's the kind of poignancy of somebody pouring out their heart, and then dressing it up as a dialogue between sinner and reason. But then that kind of being in this archive, and it's out there, it's so tender, but now you have to wear rubber gloves and, sign all the forms to get to sit there and touch it and look at it. And there's something poignant about that. I know someone sat in a chair, much like the one I'm sitting in 700 years ago, and they poured out their heart like this, and they felt these things that are so familiar. And now here I am in this place, and so much has changed and so little has changed. So yeah, that's
human beings are the constant, right? I mean, we are the constant in all this history. right?
Totally,
As human
totally.
beings, our fears, our emotions, the human nature doesn't necessarily change and all that.
Completely, completely.
So my last question: if there was a course at your university, or let's say any university, and for every term they picked three books. The course's name is Books That Matter. That's the name of the course, and it's not a definite list because every term or semester there's always three new books. So it's infinite, I guess. But you were asked, all right, what book to submit one book for one term, you know, of books that matter. What book do you think you would suggest to all these young readers? Let's say they're
Oh,
19, 20. It's a tough question, I know. But remember, it's not the infinite book because the semesters change, the books change every semester. But you have your shot to submit a book that matters.
I mean, for me, there's kind of no competition. It would be Primo Levi, If This Is a Man. His account of his life in Auschwitz, and the reason I choose that, it's a very bleak choice. I understand that. Primo Levi was a chemist who was arrested, rounded up by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz, and he survived. It's such a moving book on so many levels. He's someone who makes the point, and I mean, look, it's an impossible point to grasp, but it's also the only point to grasp, which is that it's possible to be. We accept it's not possible to be completely happy in life, right? We all accept that, but he says it's also, we don't often accept the reverse. Is also true. It's also not possible to be completely unhappy, so his account is one of finding humanity in Auschwitz, of finding some place of freedom within himself in Auschwitz, whether it's teaching his friend how to recite the Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian, or whether it's recounting the comic, tragic drama of, in the inspection sessions or the medical leave. It's such a beautiful book. It's so incredible. It's such an incredible achievement, and he's the most incredible witness to the worst that humanity can be, but also in some ways, kind of the best humanity can be.
I never read it, but I know I will now. That was really
Oh.
good. Um, well, Pete, thank you so much for taking the time. This truly was a pleasure, and I'll make sure I put all the links to your book and where the people could buy it right in the description. I highly recommend it. I kept on going to it as like a self help book. I mean, literally, your title was perfect. Self help from the Middle Ages was spot on. So, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Pete. It's been wonderful to be here. So thank you so much.